Excuse me. Can you please take your seats? We are about to start. Thank you.
Welcome to our final session. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Welcome to our final session on policy challenges after the Great Recession, which will bring the conference to a close. We're very fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us today, and I will briefly introduce them, although they probably need no introduction. Certainly Olivier needs no introduction. It's all about him. But Olivier, you know. Stanley Fischer, you also know very well, since he spent many years here as first deputy managing director, formerly governor of the Central Bank of Israel, formerly World Bank chief economist, formerly professor at MIT, and currently vice chair of the Federal Reserve. Kristin Forbes is currently on leave from MIT Sloan School, where she's a professor, was the youngest ever member of the Council of Economic Advisors in the George W. Bush 43 administration, and is currently on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England as an external member. And Federico Sturzenegger is the governor of the Central Bank of Argentina. He's held a wide variety of positions in government, in academia, including as dean of the business school at Italian University and in the private sector. By coincidence, everyone here got their doctorate from MIT. Stan is 1969. Right, Olivier 1977, me 1979, Federico 1991, and Kristin 1998. Did I get that right? I put all that back to Bob Solow, actually, who went to the Council of Economic Advisors in the Kennedy administration, and I think he instilled an ethos that has been carried on through the years that economics is great intellectual fun, but ultimately its purpose is to help people, to promote prosperity and promote better lives. And I think it's in that spirit that all of us have worked on economic policy. So I'd like to go in the following order, if that's okay, with Stan, Kristin, Federico, and then Olivier coming in at the end. We'll have some back and forth up here. I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions. I remind you that the three folks on the end are all practicing central bankers. It will save a lot of time if you don't ask them questions that you know they won't be willing to answer. Okay, so Stan.
Thanks very much, Maury, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this conference celebrating Olivier's career so far. Now, we want to have time for discussion, and although I've written a lengthy paper on Olivier's career so far, I will summarize it by saying a world-famous researcher, a superb economic counselor of the fund, a superb guide to the world through the great financial crisis, and a terrific person. So the rest of it is details. And there is a sort of strange relationship between teachers and their students, which is a bit akin to relationships between parents and their children. There are even people who've got family trees of their students and their students' students and so forth, explaining how they cover the whole world. Olivier could be one of those, but I haven't seen that particular thing. And with kids, as with students, or with students as with kids, as you get older, they get better, and there comes a point where you're getting old and they're getting better, and you realize, well, it's a good thing I knew them once, and it's great to be here, Olivier. Thank you. With today's data in the news, I'll first say a few words about labor market conditions before moving on to discuss the economic outlook and monetary policy. We've had a pretty good year in the labor market, including this morning's release for October. Payrolls have increased at an average rate of 181,000 per month this year. It's a bit slower than last year, but it's been enough to keep the unemployment rate at around 5%. The unchanged unemployment rate reflects a positive, though perhaps transitory, development. Mainly, it's a pickup in labor force participation. The rise in participation may well reflect the effects of the pickup in wages we are now seeing. When I wrote this, it said modest pickup in wages, but this morning the average hourly earnings over the last 12 months came in at a rate of increase of 2.8%, which is a quite sharp step up from the 2.5% rate in September. Over the course, I think it's important, as one talks about being data-driven and all that, over the course of the past 2 years, we need to think about the fact that over the course of the past 2 years, a variety of negative shocks have hit the U.S. economy. But employment has resumed robust growth after each temporary slowdown. This recovery, this labor market recovery, has been and continues to be powerful in terms of one of our two main targets, which is employment. And I think it's reasonable to think that the labor market is close to full employment. It's nonetheless interesting to ask what level of payroll gains would maintain an unemployment rate of roughly 5%. That, of course, depends on developments in labor force participation. If labor force participation were to remain flat, job gains in the range of 125,000 to 175,000 would likely be needed to prevent unemployment from creeping up. However, if labor force participation were to decline, as might be expected given demographic trends, the neutral rate of payroll gains would be lower. If we assume in conformity with the trend that we expect, a downward trend of about 0.3 percentage points per year in the participation rate, job gains in the range of 65,000 to 115,000 would probably be sufficient to maintain full employment. We received some encouraging news on output growth last week. After a slow first half, really slow first half, real GDP increased almost 3% in the third quarter. But we shouldn't make too much noise about this because the details were a bit less exciting than the headline number. Household spending growth slowed and residential investment declined. Business investment in equipment fell for the fourth consecutive quarter. Fortunately, a surge in exports supported growth, but much of the increase was in one product, shipments of soybeans, while exports of other goods remained tepid. Growth was also supported by a buildup in inventories, breaking a streak of 5 quarters in which inventories contributed negatively to growth, the longest such run in more than 50 years. Overall, I think it's reasonable to expect GDP growth to continue at a moderate pace, supported by household spending, renewed business investment, and the waning effects of past dollar appreciation on export growth. So we're doing pretty well on employment. What about inflation? Headline PCE, that's PCE inflation. PCE is personal consumption expenditures, and it's the price level of personal consumption expenditures that is the target for the Fed. That has moved up this year, with a 12-month change reaching 1.2% in September. As the transitory effects of the earlier fall in oil prices and rise in the dollar fade, PCE inflation can be expected to rise further toward our 2% target, supported by higher core PCE inflation, which ran at a 1.7% pace in September. So given our 2% inflation target with core PCE inflation at 1.7, we're pretty close, and we're pretty close also on the employment target. As you know, earlier this week we decided to keep the target range for the federal funds rate at 0.25% to 0.5%. As we noted in the FOMC statement, our assessment is that the most recent data have further strengthened the case for increasing the target range for the federal funds rate. The markets put a probability of above 70% on the rate being increased in December before today's data came out, and apparently the early signs are that market probability has risen, and I will make no independent estimates of what's going to happen. So far I've been discussing our very near-term economic prospects. But in terms of this conference, the more interesting and important questions relate to the next few years rather than the next few months. They relate in large part, to the secular stagnation arguments that were laid out yesterday in Larry Summers' Mundell-Fleming lecture, in particular the behavior of the rate of productivity growth. The big difference between now and 15 years ago is in the rate of productivity growth, and to a considerable extent also the decline in our demographics, a decline in the rate of growth of the labor force. Now, the emphasis yesterday was that the problem we face is largely one of demand, and we do face that problem. The question is, what is the role of productivity growth in that? Because numerically, productivity growth is a very big factor in the decline in growth. And if we say it's largely a problem of demand, that seems to say that there's a Say's law of productivity growth, namely that productivity growth will produce its own demand, or that productivity growth would be increased by an increase in the rate of growth of aggregate demand. Well, that's not an issue that can be answered purely by theorizing. Rather, it will be answered by the behavior of output and inflation as we approach, and perhaps to some extent exceed our employment and inflation targets. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to touch on two topics close to Olivier's heart, on which he's made important contributions: global imbalances and spillovers. But first, a comment about Olivier. You're almost done with 2 days, but not quite off the hook yet. You've received quite a few accolades over the last 2 days and many years, but especially the last 2 days. And I want to give you one more accolade, which I'm fairly sure you haven't gotten yet. That is MFN status. This is not a compliment on your country. This is my MFN status, is a bit different. It's most favored notebook status. I have moved around a lot over the past 20 years since you were my professor. Every time I move, I purge my office. More and more goes into the recycle bin. Less and less stays with me for my next move. But I have one treasured stack of material that has moved with me for 20 years, my most favored notebooks, MFNs. And right at the top of this stack is macro, by O. Blanchard. So I think for many of us in this room who had the honor of taking your class, it is quite a treat to look back at that notebook over the years and how many insights in that notebook are insights that still apply today, that are still useful, and still very useful frameworks for thinking about key issues. I was tempted to bring the notebook today, and my guess is there were probably some notes in there that would have prompted discussion today and are still relevant to what we're talking about. So that is at least my accolade to you today. I'm not sure if it will make your resume, but for those of us in the room who had you, it has meant quite a bit. Thank you. What I'm going to do, though, for my comments is talk about global imbalances and spillovers and try to channel some of the framework which you taught us in school. And that is how to take an important economic issue, one highly relevant for policy, boil it down to the fundamental issues, simplify as necessary, and then leave us thinking about the issue in a new way, but often without the answer, leaving us instead with key questions to think about. And that's what I'm going to try to do. So let me first start with imbalances. This is a slide from a paper which you wrote right after you started at the IMF with Gian Maria, who's probably here somewhere. And in this paper, you discussed global imbalances. You broke them into the main contributions in the different colored parts of the bars. And then you concluded global imbalances will be reduced immediately after the crisis, after 2008, but they will still be a big issue that should be front and center for policy. So what happened? I took the graph, replicated it with more recent data, and same graph through last year looks like this. So your predictions were right, as usual. Global imbalances did shrink. The main countries and regions contributing to imbalances and that received quite a bit of attention, the US in red, China in bright blue, oil exporters in the spotted area at the top. Those imbalances did shrink, but imbalances are still quite large, even years after you wrote this paper. They still are a major issue for policy. Even the discrepancy, that purple line in the middle, the trade with Mars line, has continued to be big. So there are still a number of issues related to imbalances that are important. So why are they important? In the paper which you wrote with Gian Maria, you talked about this in some detail. There are global issues related to imbalances of concern. Imbalances often reflect domestic and systemic distortions. For example, they can be too much saving, possibly because of shortages in a social safety net. They can reflect excess accumulation of reserves. They often correspond to increased domestic and systemic risks. For example, risks related to unsustainable credit growth or risks related to how those imbalances could unwind. Those are all issues which we've talked about in detail at the IMF, so I won't go through them in any more detail. There's also a whole set of literature and work, including work done at the IMF, on domestic concerns related to imbalances. Maurice Obstfeld does a very nice summary of this work in his AEA lecture in 2012, where he boils down all of the risks related to current account imbalances, and especially current account deficits, into three main categories. They often correspond to sudden stops, when capital flows, financing deficits dry up, causing sharp adjustments and painful adjustments. They generally correspond to a deterioration in international investment positions, leading to concerns about debt sustainability, and often they reflect unsustainable macro balances, often unsustainable credit booms that then end in painful reversals. So once again, a lot to be worried about, a lot of reasons why we talk about current account deficits and imbalances. But what I want to raise is one other issue which I don't think has received enough attention, which should be front and center of any discussion of global imbalances. And that is what is happening on investment income lines, in international investment income flows. And current account deficits have increasingly been affected by changes in international investment flows, less so by trade. And if we are worried about vulnerabilities related to global imbalances and adjustments related to global imbalances, we need to put these investment income flows front and center in our analysis and think about how those flows are affected by different shocks. So let me explain what I mean by that in a bit more detail. So we all know, back to grad school, especially if you had someone like Olivia as your teacher, you know that current account deficits are not equal to trade deficits. Current account balances do not equal trade balances. Current account balances correspond to savings investment imbalances, and they can be broken into the trade balance, primary and secondary investment income. Primary international investment income is primarily international investment income in the form of dividends and interest payments. Secondary investment income largely reflects international transfers. So that's the definition. We all know that. But yet when we talk about adjustments in global imbalances, we often slip into talking about adjustments through trade. And when we talk about problems with imbalances, we talk about them in the context of trade imbalances. And that's not surprising. Trade imbalances are easier to understand. They're more slow-moving. They're easier to model. We've looked at them longer for more years. We just understand them better. The investment income and secondary investment income lines are harder to understand and model, and the data is not as good. But increasingly, as capital flows, international capital flows have increased, as international assets and liabilities have increased, that means small changes in relative returns on these larger international investment positions correspond to those small changes having bigger and bigger effects on international investment income and earnings on international investments and payments on international liabilities. And as a result, these international investment lines are becoming more and more important in explaining current accounts and imbalances. So if we're going to be worried about current account balances, surpluses or deficits, we need to think about the risks related to these investment income lines. And let me just show you some data to back up that claim, that rather bold claim. Here are the countries that have the 15 largest current account deficits as a share of GDP in the world right now, with a cutoff to focus on medium and larger economies. And then I've broken these current account balances down into the share that is a trade balance and results from primary and secondary investment income. If current account balances largely reflected trade balances, those bars should be all pink. And you don't need to see the chart too closely to know it's not all pink. In fact, in many countries, current account deficits are more driven by deficits on investment income than trade deficits. Take the UK, for example, second largest current account deficit in the set. Over half of the UK's current account deficit, 5.9% of GDP, near record levels historically, more than half of that is driven by a deficit in investment income. The trade deficit actually is only a little over 2% of GDP, not nearly as much of a concern. And just to show you this isn't just an issue with current account deficits, it also works on when you look at surpluses. Here's a country that's received quite a bit of attention for its current account surplus, Japan. Current account surplus is the black line. If you break it into how much of that is trade in red or primary investment income in yellow, you see that almost all of Japan's current account surplus is a surplus on investment income. Japan is recently running a small trade deficit. So once again, if you're worried about imbalances, current accounts, we need to focus on what's going on in the yellow, what's going on in the investment income side. And where this comes even more striking is not just when you decompose how much of an imbalance in each country today can be broken into investment income versus trade, but when you look at how global imbalances are changing in many countries over time. Then you see even more powerfully the role of investment income in understanding the dynamics of global imbalances. And here's a graph that makes that point for the United Kingdom, again, a country with a large current account deficit that's received quite a bit of attention. What this graph shows is the 10-year rolling correlation between the UK current account balance and net trade in red and primary investment income in blue. Now, traditionally, in the 1990s, any movement in the UK current account balance basically corresponded to the equivalent movement in trade. Shifts in trade drove shifts in the UK current account balance. And the correlation was almost 100%. That's why the blue line is up around 1. But recently, this is completely reversed. Basically, all changes in the UK current account balance, the large shift to a large deficit, have been driven by a deterioration in investment income. Recently, the correlation between the UK current account and investment income is now roughly 100%. So what's that all mean? Tying it all together, if you want to evaluate vulnerabilities related to global imbalances and current account balances, you need to pay much more attention to what's going on in investment income flows. You need to think about how different shocks affect these investment income flows. If you're worried about certain shocks, say an increase in global risk aversion, political events in some country affecting risks about global imbalances, you need to think about how those shocks will affect investment income flows. And if you can work through this using some algebra. You need to think about things such as the size of the country's international asset and liability positions, the currency composition of the international asset and liability positions, the risk composition, and how these positions are hedged and adjust as the exchange rate adjusts. You can break it down with some algebra and some analysis, and then you can go a step further and think about what are the risks you worry about related to imbalances, how do those risks affect investment income, and then have a better understanding of the risks related to global imbalances. And you will actually find when you do that in some cases, certain types of risks actually alleviate some of the risks related to large current account deficits or imbalances, while other types of shocks can aggravate those. So a new line of thinking to hopefully push the discussion of global imbalances. I'll skip that. The last thing I'll talk about quickly, spillovers. So spillovers can happen for a whole host of reasons. They can happen because of adjustments in global imbalances. They can happen because of adjustments in monetary or fiscal policy. They can happen because of adjustments to capital controls or macroprudential policy. An endless list of reasons why spillovers can occur around the world. And don't worry, Maury, I will not go over the literature in any detail given my time ticking. But what I do want to do is raise one aspect of spillovers which I don't think is fully understood and hasn't, again, been central to the debate about spillovers and what the risks are related to spillovers and what to do about them. Now, to make that point, I'm going to show you a bunch of colorful charts. It's the end of a long 2 days, so hopefully this will keep your attention. These are the colorful charts. What these colorful charts will do is show you correlations. I'm going to first show you some correlations in financial markets. I'll focus on equity markets. And then I'll show you correlations in GDP growth. So I'm going to look at, and I'm going to use correlations as a rough measure of spillovers. So it captures how events in one market spill over to others, or how common shocks may affect a number of markets simultaneously. Now, what these graphs show you is it's lists of countries on the bottom and on the vertical axis. Each cell shows the correlation in the equity market of that pair of countries in this graph from 1985 to 1994. And then each cell is color-coded. So yellow basically means, or green basically means no correlation, yellow, small correlation, orange and red, more correlated, dark red, highly correlated. The two markets move together very tightly. And if you're not supposed to see the country names on the bottom, don't worry. The main goal is to see general trends for countries as a whole. But I've grouped the countries so the euro area is near the axis, other advanced economies out in the middle, and then emerging markets on the end. And if you could see the individual names in the individual cells, it's pretty intuitive. The diagonal axis is bright red. That's because that's the correlation of each market with itself, which is 100%. But overall, the graph is pretty cool. Markets do not move together, equity markets do not move together very tightly from 1985 to 1994. Some of the redder cells are ones that are intuitive. For example, one of the darker red ones is the US and Canada. US and Canadian equity markets move together fairly tightly, at least relative to other countries. But overall, and I'm going to show you a bunch of these, overall, it looks like equity markets around the world did not move together very tightly from 1985 to 1994. Now, fast forward, next decade, heat map gets a little bit hotter. Markets move together a bit more tightly, especially advanced economies and in the euro area. Now, fast forward to the period of the global crisis, it gets much hotter. We've jumped to another planet, the red planet. This shows that markets around the world moved very tightly during the financial crisis. Markets plummeted simultaneously, many rebounded simultaneously. Some of this, of course, reflects the high degree of volatility. Higher volatility translates into higher correlations. But even if you control for that, you do see markets moving together very tightly during this period. Now let's jump forward again. What's happened over the last 5 years, past the crisis phase? Markets are still hotter than they were in 1980s and early 1990s. Quite a bit hotter than in the early 1980s and early 1990s. Not quite as hot as during the crisis, but you do see a pattern of markets moving together quite tightly, especially advanced economies right around the axis. And what this suggests is markets tend to move up and down in a fairly synchronized fashion around the world today. So that's what we see in financial markets. Now I'm going to do the exact same exercise looking at real variables, and I'm going to focus on GDP growth. So let's go back to where we started, 1985 to 1994. The white is where there's not good data available. I'll fill that in, but ignore that for now. But what you see for growth rates is very low degrees of correlation. Not much synchronicity in growth rates around the world in the 1980s. Now, fast forward, next decade, 1990s, still a very cool heat map. GDP growth rates do not seem to be very correlated from 1995 to 2004. A little bit more than the previous 10 years, but still very low degrees of correlation. Fast forward to the crisis. Heat map gets very hot again. GDP growth rates around the world moved together during the crisis, or more concisely plummeted around 2008, and then partially rebounded largely together after that. Now, what's happened recently? This is where I think it gets particularly interesting. Last 5 years, how correlated are growth rates around the world? Just to remind you, when we looked at that for equity markets, we saw fairly tight correlations in equity markets around the world. Fairly hot heat map. Now, what's happened to GDP growth rates? Has that tight co-movement in financial markets, strong spillovers in financial markets, translated into tight co-movement in growth rates? Okay, look at that, remember that, close your eyes for a minute, and I'm going to fast forward to growth. This is what it looks like today for growth rates. Very low levels, correlations in GDP growth rates around the world, despite very high levels of correlations in asset markets around the world. And that leaves us with the two questions, actually one thing first. Just to show you, I did not cherry pick my time periods to make this point. This graph basically shows exactly what I showed you, but instead of picking what decades or 5-year windows to look at, I calculate the correlations in equity returns on the left, growth on the right, using rolling 5-year averages. And here you see the same patterns I highlighted. Higher correlations during the crisis in both equity markets and growth. But for equity markets, upward movement in correlations, equity markets around the world have moved together more and more tightly over time and are now quite tightly correlated. Growth rates, though, do not show this upward movement, and growth rates around the world are at very low degrees of correlation. And I will end with the questions that raises. Why? Why are financial markets so tightly correlated? Why do financial markets move together so tightly, yet this doesn't translate into similar tight movements in GDP growth rates? And if this is true, what are the implications? Should we be as worried about spillovers if they largely occur in financial markets but don't translate over into real GDP growth rates? And I'll end with that.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Maurice, for the invitation. It's a fantastic and great honor to be here and sharing this panel. And honoring Olivier, he was my teacher, and boy, having a class with Olivier, it had one problem, which is that it ended at some point. You were sitting there, and you just wanted it to go on and on and on forever because it was so perfect, and all the pieces fit together, and you could actually go through 20 years of literature in 1 hour and a half, and it was absolutely fantastic. I have one personal story with him. Olivier was not my thesis advisor, but about 1 month before we had to send out our job market papers, I got the luck to be invited to his macro lunch. So we met at lunch, and someone made a presentation. So I started the presentation, and kind of in the middle, Olivier points to something which didn't work in the paper, and in fact it was a mistake, and it brought all the architecture of the paper down. It's okay, so it was a bit awkward. I went back home, I laid in my bed, and I started crying. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried. But about 8 p.m., I stopped crying because there were no more tears to shed, I just didn't have any more, so I said, I'm going to pull myself together. I had 15 days to write another paper, which I kind of managed to do, and it got me a job, so it was not a great paper, but it did the job, and the reason I'm standing here today is because he basically picked up that mistake. So I was a beneficiary of your generosity, of your time, and your toughness, but I think so. I think probably I'm the person in this room who has more to owe to you than anybody else. So thanks for that. I'm going to talk about 3 themes that I think are policy challenges that we have now. One is about angry people. We have a lot of angry people out there, We have angry people in the streets of Brazil. We have angry people in Greece. We have Donald Trump. We have Brexit. We have people voting against a peace program in Colombia. So what's going on? So that's going to be the first thing, and what policy challenges it basically brings. Then the second one is, I'm going to talk for a second about low interest rates. I'm not going to develop the issue. You study that issue much more than us in emerging markets, but I'm going to give you two perspectives from emerging markets on the issue of low interest rates. And then my third topic is going to be how come that you have low interest rates and such low interest rates in the developed world which coexist with high yields in the emerging world. So what's happening with capital markets and capital flows that this is not somehow profiting from these low returns going to the high yields somewhere. So let me start with the angry people. I would say there are two very standard explanations of this. One is that you have globalization, people who lose out from the globalization process. That's a very standard answer to this question. The second is about stagnant growth. I mean, the world is growing very slow, so it's not generating enough output and wealth for everybody to be on board and everybody to be happy. I don't like neither of these two stories. For example, if you were to talk with Marek Belka, which is a former president of the Central Bank of Poland, he said, look, over the last 30 years, few countries had the amount of economic and welfare progress that Poland had, and still people are revolting against the political system. The US economy has done very well, the UK itself. So I think the issue of the globalization losers and the stagnant growth is too easy of an answer to this question. I must say that about stagnant growth, I think we have an issue here. I mean, the GDP is going digital. GDP is going. Let me give you an example. The other day they gave the Nobel Prize to Bob Dylan. So I get my 3 kids and I asked them to listen to me to Blowing in the Wind, a video of Bob Dylan. So my 10-year-old kid says, but Dad, that video has only 50,000 views. Let me show you this, Uptown Funk. I think it was something like that. 1 billion viewers, okay? So this is serious stuff, okay? This is what really works. Now, that's entertainment. We never paid for it. Who paid for it? Where's the economic value of that? Where are the CDs which supposedly were in GDP, which accounted for that entertainment? And so I think we have some measurements problems there in terms of this world which is going digital. Let me point out to a wonderful paper by Jeremy Greenwood, which is called 1974, which has to do with the productivity slowdown that Stan was talking about. And what Greenwood says in that paper, looking at the productivity slowdown in the 1970s, is that was a decade when firms were absorbing the technology of the beginning of the computer age. So firms were invested a lot of their capital in changing their forms of production. That basically showed us low productivity growth during that decade, but then engineered a very high productivity, or allowed and made possible very high productivity growth in the 1980s and the 90s. So I think the low growth and the low productivity growth that we're seeing today has very much the same features, but at a more profound and more dramatic way. So that is a good link to what I think is the real explanation for why there are angry people out there, which is that people realize that expected future growth is going to be very high. So it's completely opposite to the hypothesis that we work here. I don't think they've run Giuseppe Spertola's regression, but they sure are smelling that coefficient of TFP and unemployment, okay? And so imagine that the job which hires more males in the U.S. is truck drivers, 3.5 million truck drivers in the U.S. Now you read in the newspaper that now you have trucks that don't need truck drivers, and you certainly get a little bit nervous. So I think my hypothesis is that people are feeling, anticipating, sensing that there's a huge technological revolution brewing, and as any revolution, that makes people very nervous. So they want politicians to just give the message that they're going to take care of them and that they're going to be careful about that, and that's what they're receptive to. And when the G20 tackles this issue as an issue of inclusive growth, I think it's a backward-looking approach. They're looking what has happened, how has growth developed, what has happened to income distribution, but people are worried about future dynamics and not so much backward dynamics. So that's my first thing. On low interest rate, real interest rates have been coming down for about 30 years. I think there are very structural reasons why real interest rates are coming down. You have issues from the savings side, longer lives, higher incomes, fewer children, for example, in China, are all factors which generate a higher savings rate. And on the investment side, you have that, again, as the economy goes more digital, investment becomes lighter. You don't need so much bricks. You don't need so much bolts. Investment is much more knowledge. Investment is much more in software. I don't know we understand very well if that's more capital intensive than bricks and mortars. I tend to think that it's less capital intensive. So you have a world which is generating more savings and is using less savings, and that generates a reduction in the price of savings. That's a reduction in the interest rate. So here we are in the developed world tinkering with the negative interest rates. Well, you know how we call negative interest rates in kind of a country like Argentina? We call it financial repression. And trust me, it doesn't work, okay? So if you persist in a policy, first of all, that it's very difficult because people disintermediate immediately from an asset with negative real interest rate. Of course, Alan Paulsen said, well, grandmothers maybe react relatively slowly, but eventually people will react to that and you'll generate a lot of financial disintermediation. So careful with that. I see a lot of discussion in the developed world on negative real interest rates, and I think it's useful to go and look at emerging markets to see what our experience has been with that in a structural sense, in the sense of what it does to the financial sector and financial intermediation. And the other thing which I would point out about negative and very low interest rates is that there's a political economy issue. So as interest rates come down, asset prices go up. So those who hold assets become richer and richer because the price of assets are coming up. Now the small saver, which basically has their bank account, and they're getting very, very little return on those savings. So I think there's a political economy issue, which I think may have to do a little bit with the first issue that or the first challenge that I was discussing. That takes me to, I have 2 minutes, so that takes me to the third issue, which is this arbitrage. How can we have at the same time such low interest rates in the developed world and then relatively high yields in the emerging market? And I think there are 2 hypotheses to pose here for discussion. One is that, well, the perception of risk in emerging market has not come down or is still there, and that explains. I don't see that as a plausible explanation because I think macroeconomic policy has become much sounder in the emerging market world. A second hypothesis is that it's regulation post-2008. After 2008, we've imposed a lot of constraints on what banks can do, what kind of risk banks can take, and that certainly has been generating an increasing problem. The problem is profits of banks. So now we're starting to see at the Basel Committee, a discussion is, well, now we have to focus on bank profitability because we've been caring about the solvency and the soundness of the financial sector. Now, if the banks don't make any money, that's not the good road for solvency and stability in the longer term. So suddenly, I think we are probably at the beginning of a phase where the financial community, because of the low returns, will actually ask for deregulation, and therefore, I ask myself if we're at the beginning of a new cycle of deregulation and capital market liberalization and financial deregulation, which will generate one of those cycles of capital flows coming back and forth. Now, so I think from the developed economy world's perspective, you have to think if you want that to happen or not. I think that's a very important policy discussion here. From the emerging market perspectives, I think it's this availability of capital basically implies that the value of having sound macroeconomic policy increases because there's ample capital, and then the countries which have sounder macroeconomic policies will attract that. But of course, we have the same things and the same concerns that we've discussed. For example, problems with the exchange rate policy and the exchange rate volatility and exchange rate appreciation as recipients of this capital flow. So I think that's the problem. Now, in the last, and I finish with this, which I think has to do with this. Germany is going to have the presidency of the G20 next year, and they basically established as one of their main themes, of the two themes, one was financial inclusion and the other was infrastructure in Africa. And it took me a while to understand why that was the focus of the Germany's presidency of the G20 and that they were going to concentrate on that. I think it has to do with this. It has to do with the fact that you see low yields in the developed world. You see opportunities for higher yield in the developing world. A lot of that, you would want a lot of that investment to go to infrastructure, to go to housing, and we have to think of ways, and that's done in a sustainable, in a sensible, from a macroeconomic consistent way. So I think it's a very important issue to be discussed going forward. Thank you.
I have one advantage relative to all the other speakers. I do not need to spend 2 minutes talking about Olivier Blanchard. However, I want to thank and really thank from the depth of my heart all the people who have participated to this day and a half and all the people I've worked with or helped in previous years. It is a very special event. And I can tell you that I'm profoundly moved by what I've heard. Let me turn to the topic of the panel as it was given to me. You can think of it as a drier version of what Larry Summers talked about yesterday. You will see some difference in style, but it is about the same issues. So let me just go at it. So, like Larry, and probably more so than I believe 3 years ago, I believe that he's largely right, that we're likely to live for some time in a world where the safe real interest rate, R, is low, maybe negative, and that where potential growth, is also low, real potential growth. This being said, and I thought Larry actually was convincing yesterday, we really don't know. We have many explanations for why R has decreased. Some of them imply it will continue, some of them imply it may not. And the same thing is true of slowdown in productivity growth. We had 10 good years, they went away. Will they come back? We don't know. So I think any policy advice has to start from the expected values, which are low, but deal with the standard deviation bands, which are large. A lot of the discussion at this stage is in the rebalancing from monetary policy to fiscal policy, the feeling that monetary policy has been exhausted and that policymakers should be focusing on fiscal policy. What I want to do is focus much more on the long run being where we want to be in 10 years or 15 years. And I think there the same argument is that if we are in the environment I described earlier, then there is indeed less room, structurally less room for monetary policy and structurally more room for fiscal policy. So we're not talking about a temporary shift from one to the other, but a much more permanent one. I'm going to do this, and I'm struck by the difference in content between what I'm going to say and what Stan talked about, which is what he has to care about the next few weeks, the next few months. I'm really going to do this at a 30,000 feet level, but I hope I make a few useful points. Low G complicates, low growth complicates life in many ways. It's a tougher environment, no matter what. I mean, basically, it's much harder to deal with inequality. It's much harder to reduce debt. We understand that. So in that context, I want to turn to monetary policy first, and then to fiscal policy. And so on monetary policy, I'm going to make a simple point. But a point that I very strongly believe, that basically we've been told, well, when we get to the zero lower bound, if we need to get there, we have these other tools, which are unconventional monetary policy tools. And so we can really go much further than we thought. I think that's correct, but we have to understand what we're doing, which is the way I think about conventional monetary policy, moving the federal funds rate when you can move it, is basically moving all the rates more or less together. It has some effect on the spreads, but that's second order. And we think of this as removing a distortion. There is a distortion in the economy, which is nominal rigidities, and therefore the interest rate by itself would not go to the right place, and we put it in the right place, the so-called neutral rate, right? So conceptually, monetary policy is the answer to a distortion. It's a policy which responds to a distortion and does something useful. Where I think the unconventional monetary policy is having a much more doubtful status from that point of view. And if you think of it as a first approximation, it's dealing with the risk spreads, with the spreads between the returns on different assets. And so the question is, well, in terms of distortions, does it undo distortions, namely the structure of risk spreads that existed before was wrong and we're correcting it, or is it creating distortions at the service of aggregate demand, but still creating distortions? Was the amount of risk-taking insufficient, and when we decrease the risk spreads, we're creating more risk-taking, which is good? Or are we doing this, we're creating more risk-taking, but it's not good? My sense is, to a first approximation, and again, there are nice papers by Jeremy Stein and others, to a large extent, I think it's creating distortions. It's creating distortions in the name of something very useful, which is to maintain demand and maintain output at potential, but it is creating distortions. And that seems to me to be the fundamental difference between the two, and why I don't like, in general, the idea that we're going to rely on it. So this being said, how do we avoid that? Well, we want to use conventional rather than unconventional, and then there are basically two ways out, as we know. The first one is what I've pushed over time, which is higher inflation, which means higher nominal rates, more room. I must say that on this, I have slightly retreated because I've realized that one of the great advantages of having inflation in the 0 to 2%, maybe 3% range, is that it stops being salient in the mind of people. Inflation is not something they think about. As a result, expectations of inflation are very sticky, and as a result, the job of the central bank is much easier. When you have to worry about destabilizing expectations, it becomes a much more complex game. So I think there is something to be said for low inflation as something that people don't think about, and that really simplifies the job of the central bank. So I don't know at this stage whether I would push 4% as much as I did. I still think there are good arguments, but I would want to think more. The other way of doing it is what Ken Rogoff, Miles Kimball, and others have pushed, which is to basically go to a cashless, or at least less cash economy. And I've come to a conclusion that maybe that's not as insane as I thought it was initially. That maybe we can indeed, by eliminating the $100 bills and the $500 bills, make it very costly to have large amounts of currency held directly, and that this gives probably more room to decreasing the rate, the negative rate on deposits, and that maybe we can go further with some, I think, opposition from people, but it may well be a better solution in the end, as crazy as it sounded to me when it was first put out. So these are general remarks on monetary policy. Let me move to fiscal policy. I think that's where there are many fascinating issues of much relevance to policy. So let's take as given that R minus G, so the safe real rate minus the real growth rate, is going to be negative, maybe not forever. Nothing is forever, but for a long time. But let's just assume forever for simplicity. Now, what should we do in terms of fiscal policy in that environment? So that's where we have to think very hard about the relation between the marginal product of capital, which is a random variable, right, the growth rate, and the safe rate. So there's one configuration, which is the usual dynamic inefficiency of our theoretical models, in which the growth rate is greater than the marginal product of capital, and the marginal product of capital is greater than the safe rate R. So we have the first inequality in the first bullet. In that case, what does theory say? it says something very strong. It says first you can issue debt and never repay it, because it will basically go down as a ratio to GDP, even if you never have a primary surplus. And in addition, it's very good because you had too much capital, and PK was basically too low, right? And so in this case, it's very clear, in a dynamically inefficient economy, you want to have debt, you never repay it, it decreases capital, and it's good. Okay. Are we in that situation? Almost surely not. What is clear is that the marginal product of capital remains fairly high. And basically the rates of return that you see currently are of the order of 5 to 15%, so higher than the growth rate. So we're in a different environment in which I think the marginal product of capital is higher than the growth rate. So MPK is greater than G, that's the next bullet, and it's greater than R, the safe rate, right? So in that environment, what do you want to do? Well, the first thing to say is that this may be an environment in which debt is still not sustainable. Think of an Auro de Boer world. I'm sorry to bother you with this so late in the second day, but think of the Auro de Boer world with complete markets. You're going to quite possibly have, because if people are very risk averse, a safe rate which is negative. Now that's not an environment in which the government can do anything useful, because basically the safe rate is reflecting high risk aversion. So in this case, you would probably want to conduct fiscal policy the way you do it in a normal environment. But the next point is, in fact, the spread between the marginal product and the real rate, think of it as the equity premium, may reflect some incomplete markets or some liquidity aspect of the safe asset, which makes it, in this case, which makes it very attractive and therefore have a very low rate. So in this case, in this case, you're going to see a high marginal product, you're going to see a growth rate which is smaller, you're going to see a safe rate which is even smaller, maybe negative, and you can actually do something. What you can do is you can issue debt and never repay it, right? Still, because basically R is less than G. Now, you can do it. The question is, should you do it, right? And that's the relevant question for fiscal policymakers. So that gets me to my last slide, and that's where I get closer to the issues that Larry was talking about yesterday. So suppose that the spread between the marginal product and the safe rate is due to liquidity. It's a liquidity premium which comes from the fact that T-bills are traded in a market which is very liquid, and you're willing basically to have a very low rate of return in order to have the liquidity that you value. So in this case, and let's assume that MPK is not random, R is not random, so that's for sure. Okay, so you can basically just go at it. So the liquidity premium is defined, if I can read my writing, as X. So the safe rate is equal to the marginal product minus the liquidity premium, and the safe rate is less than G. So in this case, you can issue debt and never have to repay it. Basically, you don't need to generate primary surpluses. You don't need to have distortionary taxation, because debt will increase at a lower rate than the economy itself. So the debt to GDP ratio will go down. What should you then do? So you have the opportunity of doing something which is very attractive. Just issue debt and never repay it. Okay. So the first point is, should you basically proceed to finance public investment if the marginal product of capital, public capital, is greater than zero? And the answer is no, that's not. If you're at full employment, start from full employment. If you're going to do this, you're going to increase demand, something has to give, because at full employment you cannot increase output, you're basically there. So in this case, the relevant opportunity cost is the marginal product of private capital. So in this case, what this says is do public investment if the marginal product of public investment is higher than the marginal product of private investment, private capital. It is not obviously true in practice. I think it's true surely of some projects, but zero is not the reference point. Right. Now you get to the next point, which I think is what Larry had in mind, which is suppose that we're not at full employment, suppose that there is an output gap, right? Well, in this case, actually, you should definitely issue debt, increase demand, spend it whichever way you want on public investment or on wages of public sector employees, right? Because you can do this, you can increase demand, and there's absolutely no opportunity cost. You never have to raise taxes again, but that basically will slowly go down relative to GDP. So when you have an output gap, whatever the opportunity cost of spending, not just public investment, but any public spending, is more or less zero if the interest rate, if the safe rate is zero. I think that's a very strong message, and I think that shapes a lot of what Larry was thinking about yesterday. Then the last point is an even more fascinating point, but very relevant one for Stan and the Fed and for the Treasury, which is I've said that basically the government, when it issues T-bills, has this liquidity advantage, this very large market. Well, shouldn't it use it more, basically, to finance things in the economy? If, as a borrower, it can borrow on better grounds, on better terms than the private borrowers, because it basically has this market that it has, maybe because it also can raise taxes right? Shouldn't it be doing it? And therefore, shouldn't basically the government be much more in the financial intermediation business? And should it be the Treasury, which issues that and then lends it to others, or should it be the central bank, which basically trades on the yield curve in order to basically decrease the cost of borrowing for some? So I think these are big issues. This last issue is very much about the size of the balance sheet of a central bank, but it's more general than that. It's the size of the balance sheet of the government as a whole. And I think these are issues that we have to think about. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Given the time constraints, I'd like to move right to the audience questions, and I'll also invite the panel to weigh in on points they want to weigh in on, even if questions are directed to another member of the panel. So, audience questions?
Yes, I'm Bert Korowski, and I might insist here briefly on a point. Why do you say that interest rates on public debt are low when they are based on so much of regulatory subsidies? Add to the zero low rates of the public debt all those costs that comes from not giving SMEs and entrepreneurs, millions of them, the chances for credit only as a result of these distortions produced by the risk-weighted capital requirements.
Should I
go for it?
This is the theme that you have explored over the years, I would say. You're absolutely right that the answer is if a very low safe rate is due to distortions, then the first order of business should be to eliminate the distortions. That's true, if you're right, of regulation, but it may be true of the lack of social insurance in some countries, which leads people to basically be willing to save enormous amounts that they should not be saving. It could be true because of missing markets. For all these reasons, you're absolutely right that step zero in what I said is let's make sure that we have removed as many of the distortions as we can which affect R, so that we have the right R. I take your point.
Okay, Ted Truman.
Ted Truman. Olivier, is the logical extension of your remarks that governments should be issuing consols at this point in time? I've thought about this, for example, in the context of a Greek restructuring, right, which would lock in a long-term rate forever and you never have to pay back the debt. Governments, we presume, go on forever, so the issues. But the question is whether the logic of your proposition, which was qualified in terms of the conditions, is that governments should be essentially issuing consols, which would satisfy a savings constraint or lack of savings vehicles, and you would then, as you say, never have to pay it back.
I think that the general direction in which you go is the right one. It's actually a point that Larry made yesterday. I mean, if there is uncertainty about the course of R and G over the infinite future, then you should borrow, the government should borrow as long as it can, as long maturity as it can. That's why Larry talked about the long rates being low. You want to lock in the long rates as much as you can. And so I think that the logic is indeed in this context, because of the uncertainty about R&G, you should probably issue long maturity bonds.
And we do see some trend toward more issuance of very long-term bonds. Stanley.
Ted, I think your point would be exactly right if the long-term rate was zero, but it isn't. And it isn't because nobody knows that consoles will be serviced forever. Something will happen. Something usually happens. So I think, yes, they should be doing that. If it was zero, they'd be doing the same as printing money, but it could be in large amounts. We used to finance. We used to have $10,000 bills and $10,000 notes and things like that. So I think the story is basically correct in terms of what Olivier said. Finance using long-term bonds, because most of us, at least old enough to remember positive interest rates, suspect that we will have positive interest rates and higher interest rates in the future. So lock it in and keep it low and stop issuing what?
Stop issuing.
Oh, well, do you mean when we get... Well, we'd have to keep issuing if the problem is a shortage of saving.
Jump in there?
Yes,
I'd say if
please
we're
do.
going to have a major discussion of new types of debt issuance and rethinking bond issuance, I think on the table should also be a discussion of growth index debt or GDP-linked debt. If your main concern is whether debt is sustainable, if you are hit with negative shocks in the future and can't repay the debt and you could end up in a debt spiral, an obvious solution would be to have more growth-linked debt. Then if debt deteriorates, you pay less on your debt and you would have an automatic smoothing then without having to shift to quite as dramatic a shift as you were proposing.
Well, Kristin, as you know, I've been working on GDP-linked bonds as well. They can really decrease the risk considerably. And if you're worried about the debt to GDP ratio exceeding some level, they can really reduce the distribution of what can happen. So I think that's something that should be thought about very hard.
I think we should call on Federico to describe the Argentine experience.
We pay 6.5% still, so we're trying to get it down.
No, but you had GDP index.
We had GDP warrants. GDP warrants, you have to be very careful with implementation. Very careful. For example, in the case of Argentina, there was amount of output growth, and you paid the coupon if growth was above that number, which was 3.22% per year. So you can imagine when the growth rate is 3.21, the incentives that you have and the kind of things really kind of got a little bit out of control in Argentina with. So I think it's a good instrument, but you have to be careful on implementation.
Okay. Marcos.
Marcos Chamon, Western Hemisphere Department. Question to the panel, an issue that Federico touched on his presentation. How would we see growth in developing countries in a situation of secular stagnation on the advanced economies? If the frontier has low R, low G, do we still imagine a growth convergence type of model, or would the process become more difficult?
I think, sorry, you're waiting for someone to speak?
No. Yes.
On the assumption that it's possible to, for instance, through the development of human capital, to still produce positive real rates of return and higher rates of return than emerging market than the advanced countries, you would still expect some extent of convergence. And my guess is that over the course of time there will be higher rates in developing countries, even risk-adjusted. There will be higher rates.
If I may, I think the whole point of what I was saying is there are high yields in emerging markets. I think somehow we have capital which is not flowing. We need to understand how to get that done in a sound way. And if we actually get that sorted out, I think there has to be convergence over the medium term.
Yes, please.
So Stan is focused on interest rates. On growth rates, and the question is when technological progress at the frontier slows down, decreases, what happens to the convergence process to the countries which are catching up? And you could think that this would be rather independent, that the speed at which they can absorb new technologies remains more or less the same, and they're so far from the frontier that they continue to grow fairly fast. But the empirical evidence is that it seems that convergence also has slowed down a bit. And I think it's a very different phenomenon from the slowdown of technological progress at the frontier. I'm not at all a specialist, but I have a sense that what is known as the middle income trap is not irrelevant, that a number of countries are at the point at which they are struggling to find the best way of converging, and in particular in the case of Africa. I think that's a very relevant thing. But these are very different dynamics. One is about innovation and invention, the other is about adapting. And I think both of them are having some trouble at this point.
One of the convergence problems for emerging markets and low-income countries, the African example is a good one, is some of the most valuable infrastructure would involve cooperation by several governments. And the EU has solved this problem, but if you think of so a number of African countries collaborating on a big highway that would link them, that would be very valuable for intra-regional trade. It's just not that easy. And so it's kind of a challenge to think about how capital would be deployed to exploit this potentially very high social marginal product. Yes?
In the context of the quantity theory of money of Milton Friedman, what is the effect of the velocity of the US dollars on the economic growth of the US?
Sounds like a question for the Fed.
I thought one of the most, we're all talking about Larry's speech last night, I thought one of the most interesting parts of Larry's speech was the statement that in current circumstances, the money supply is not of any great, the M1 money supply is no longer of the same significance that it had 20 or 30 years ago, because with huge amounts of excess reserves, the money stock is essentially whatever is demanded, and it goes along with what is happening to GDP. It's not causing GDP. The absence of it is not a problem that is holding back the growth of GDP at present.
Okay. There's the effect of the velocity of the US dollars on the US economy.
Yeah, the velocity is the inverse of the demand for money, and I don't think that's a problem.
Okay, Guido Lorenzoni.
Hi. Yes, so I have a question for Olivier. I see a bit of a tension between your first slide and your last slide. Like in your first slide, you kind of dislike QE because by swapping assets, you're encouraging risk-taking. But it seems that the intermediation that you discussed at the end of your last slides would have similar, if in some sense it's the same, is a form of the same thing, right? It would be like the government putting government bonds in people's hands and taking some risky asset out of the system, so changing incentives for risk-taking. So I'm missing something, or?
No, you're not missing. There's a slight tension between the slides, which is that the first slide says what it looks like, structure of premium is about right, and so if you change it, you're going to introduce distortions, where I think the example I gave at the end suggests that instead, maybe it is not right, maybe the liquidity premium is just too large, and in which case it would be good to reduce it. I think when I was aware of it, and so that's why I mentioned the paper by Jeremy Stein, who argues that a larger balance sheet of a central bank may actually be useful because it would basically provide for a liquid asset that is not provided by the private sector. So that's an example in which the decrease in one spread is actually a good thing. It's maybe not undoing a distortion, but it's doing a good thing. So, but you're right that there's a bit of a tension between the two.
Yeah, I've read discussion in the United States of talk of running the economy hot in order to cure hysteresis caused by recessions. Is there in macroeconomics empirical evidence that this works, or is this theory?
This empirical evidence is being intensely examined at the present.
I think, let me say a bit more. It has been examined now by Larry and I for about a year. I think it is safe to say that it looks as if after recessions, so I'm not talking about booms here, I'm talking about recessions, the economy doesn't seem to return to the pre-recession trend. That even recessions which look like they are caused by mostly demand shocks, so we think they should go back to trend, don't quite go back to trend most of the time. I see this, having worked on it now for a year or more, I see this as a likely true fact. There are many issues there. There is still a lot of uncertainty about the size of the effect. We don't know whether it's symmetrical. We don't know whether it's worse in recessions, or it is only in recessions and not in booms, or is it symmetric? Do booms basically kind of do the reverse? So there's a lot we don't know, but I think the argument for running the economy, I can say this, I'm not at the Fed, for running the economy slightly above what looks like potential, probably doesn't have much cost, and may well allows for reenfranchising some of the people who are not participating. It's a risky proposition, so you have to think about what if it's not true. But on that, if I were in Stan's shoes, which I'm not, I would be tempted to do it.
Yesterday Larry mentioned the IS curve has shifted to the left. We need to shift it out. That was very close to arguments that he was making in 2008 when he was making around the clock on the Sunday morning shows. There's a big hole in aggregate demand. We need to fill it. Back then it was a cyclical argument, but now it looks like it's a trend problem too. In today, Olivier mentioned that there are conditions under which you actually could or should shift the aggregate demand IS out. But in 4 days, it's going to be an election. We're mother of all elections. No discussion of educating the public about what is IS, what is not. But the argument is missing is the political economy of shifting the IS out. And that's a harder one, but it's something that as economists we need to address. I was wondering what would be the arguments on the political side of it.
What does it say? We French citizens don't comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we can educate the public about the position of the IS curve, but we can surely explain that spending on public investment would have good effects in the short run on the construction industry and various other industries, and would do good things in the long run. And I think that's a political message that the Clinton campaign has articulated and should resonate.
I think it's actually true that both campaigns have spoken favorably of infrastructure. Not a clear path for always paying for it, but Mark.
Thank you. I just was wondering, in light of Olivier's last, Olivier, in light of his last slide, could share with us his perspectives on IMF fiscal policy advice. Thank you.
I'm happy to. So I think the big issue is fiscal space. Is there fiscal space? And my position, which actually is the same as the one I had when I was still here, is that you cannot do it by the numbers. And the example I always give is the example of a country which has a 100% debt to GDP ratio to start, think Spain, where investors are basically don't seem to be very worried. Spreads are low. It's not entirely due to the ECB. And so they think at 100% they can probably make it, and that is sustainable. Then the Spanish government decides to embark on a public investment project, which is vetted by Brussels for its realism, and decides to spend 2% more a year for 2 years. So that's 4%. This, in terms of the shift in the ice curve, is a very substantial fiscal expansion, right? Through the multiplier, and use the number you prefer, GDP increases because of the increase in demand, and so that goes at the end of 2 years from 100% to 102%, right? As a result of a program which has led to public investment, has led to an increase in gross debt of 2% relative to the initial 100, right? Do you think that the investors will think that this is the end of the world? So it seems to me in that case, if it is well explained, if it is well vetted, there is fiscal space, even in a country which has 100% debt to GDP. Leaving aside the argument I gave about R and G, I think I would do it even if R was greater than G. So it seems to me that's the way to think about it, and that goes back to the big issue. Are there things which are useful to do, which justify an increase in gross debt, or at least no fiscal consolidation? And that's how I think about it. So there are very few countries where I think that there is no fiscal space. There are some, but not many.
Hi, my question is for Kristin. Would you agree that a possible hypothesis to why the current account imbalances rely more on investment income flows in advanced economies after the financial crisis is due to non-conventional monetary policies, meaning that this type of instrument through QEs increases liquidity in the world and increases global vulnerabilities and distortions? Thank you.
So from the data that I've looked at, no, there's no break around the time of the global financial crisis. If anything, these investment income has become more important gradually over time as international investment positions have grown gradually over time. And if anything, since the crisis, there have been some big shifts in international investment positions, and they are not growing at the same rate they were before, and yet the investment income line is mattering even more and more. So I'd say there are probably a lot of reasons that have gone into it, but it's hard to link the crisis to it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that Larry mentioned yesterday and also referenced obviously in Olivier's presentation and mentioned by Stan and sort of in a marginal way on the role of money in the economy or the velocity, etc. I think the point was made by Larry that many of the elements of monetary policy that central banks relied on for a long time are no longer the same. We can't view them the same. High-powered money is no longer high-powered money. Balance sheet looks like a variable rate debt of the consolidated balance sheet of the public sector. And some of the things that central banks have done, whether it's their independence, in fact, or their inflation targeting, seem to have run their course. My question is, at the end of all of that, are we at a paradigm shift, an inflection point in terms of what central bank role should be? The establishment of the independent central bank ran for a very long time. I had a golden age of central banks. Inflation targeting got very fashionable, in fact was very useful obviously in the US and some other countries. It's a dual mandate. That's done fine, but now the parameters that ran that model seem to have all switched personalities. Their character is different, their role is different. Should we be thinking about a different paradigm shift in the role of central bank in the post-crisis economy, low growth, low real interest rates, and so on?
It's to you. Okay, thanks. George, I think a key point is that something I think everybody on the stage will remember, that we were taught monetary policy goes through interest rates. And so some of the paraphernalia that is associated with the operation of monetary policy, which focuses on money, is probably not necessary if you think you can control interest rates and go through that approach. So in terms of the sort of mechanics, I don't think it'll change somewhat because portfolio bank balance sheets, central bank balance sheets will be larger, and that may take some more thinking than has so far been done. But in terms of the issues that were raised yesterday about coordination between the central bank and the Treasury and so forth, I think the essential model of an independent central bank, the argument about that is a valid one. I mean, we can all write down models. We know that the optimum is full coordination with a bunch of people who really operate in a particular direction, all agreed on what the goals are. My guess is that we will find that the independence of the central bank, which is extremely useful, as you know, George, in emerging market countries and developing countries, is going to remain a key point, key feature of the structure of the monetary policy system for a long time. Yet, you know, I better stop there.
I want to second what Stan said. I mean, you have lots of counterfactuals about how countries have done without an independent central bank. I mean, I was being told that Larry was advocating kind of diluting this, but my own country is, I think, a good example that you want to look at. And I mean, of course, we're not talking about the same dimensions, but I think this is one of the most established benefits that principles and the benefits that have derived from this. So think about the counterfactuals.
Luca.
Can I?
Oh, sorry.
I mean, just to repeat something that Stan said, we have to distinguish between mandate and instruments. And it's clear that as long as the balance sheets remain very large and the central bank has to pay interest on reserves, then the old way of doing business doesn't work. So you have to change it. But that's plumbing. I think as far as the mandate goes, it's still output gap, inflation, with a question mark about financial stability as part of a mandate and what instruments are used. But that hasn't changed much. And inflation targeting, which was always defined in terms of using actually the interest rate, remains, I think, the starting point of the discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks. Luca Ricci, IMF. I wonder if, to the extent we believe that the massive trend downward of interest rate over the past few decades, it's a sign of an IS shifting to the left, like Larry was mentioning yesterday, and maybe potentially a cause of secular stagnation. It's, of course, very important to think how monetary and fiscal policy can cope with that, but I wonder if we should also focus on trying to understand better the reasons why there was this massive decline in interest rate, and to the extent we understand those, try to neutralize them. For example, if we think that there is massive savings because countries after the Asian crisis now fear risks being larger, then maybe international pooling of reserves could be one way to help. If safety net in China are not strong enough and they have a massive spillover on global interest rates, then maybe we can coordinate with China to help increase that. If income inequality in the US has been mentioned yesterday as one of the reasons why consumption came down because of distribution, maybe we can reduce income inequality in the US. If demographics is one of the reasons why we're having this decline in interest rates, first of all, that will be temporary, and then we can try to help pensioners cope with that. So I wonder, going back to the savings and investment stories that drive the decline in interest rates, should we address the problem directly as opposed to indirectly through monetary and fiscal policy? Thanks.
So that's the same question as was asked earlier. You have different examples, but you know what is behind the decrease in R? Is it distortions? And if it's distortions, let's try to work on them. And you've taken other examples than regulation, but I think that's fair. But to think that one should work on income inequality in order to decrease the safe rate seems to me to be a bit backwards. I think there are other reasons to want to work on income inequality than decreasing the safe rate. But surely we should do something about income inequality, and to the extent that it increases the safe rate, then it's a good thing. But you're completely right, except that many of these things are extremely difficult to do. Creating a system of social insurance in China is not exactly something which is trivial to do, and so on and so on. If it's risk aversion, it's very difficult to know how you reassure people in the current environment. But at the general level, you're completely right.
Yeah, sorry. This issue has been discussed under the title of the only game in town, where central banks are not comfortable being the only active policy player directed at the macroeconomy, and so that question has been looked at, and we know in fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy is obviously something. If it was directed at infrastructure, it would have particular effects in terms of future growth, which would contribute to dealing with that gap. So these things have been researched, are being researched, and the recommendations are made in a way that suggests that more can be done in order to get away from such low rates of return on such low government interest rates.
Okay, last question.
So my question goes to Olivier. Based on your projections that global imbalances will reduce after the crisis of 2008, and Kristin has presented here that it has happened, we have seen that there are still huge imbalances, particularly in the oil-producing countries. What is your understanding in terms of a fiscal maneuver, particularly for oil-producing countries that recently had to implement a number of adjustments, corrections on exchange rate that led to a huge decrease of GDP? In some cases, we have seen the debt ratio to the GDP increasing dramatically. A number of countries have developed financial capital markets with the linked bonds to exchange rate. And given those situations, they face a situation in which they have less resources, less incomes to repay the debt. At the end of the day, a number of those economies have short-term resources, not long-term resources. We don't see pension funds, the role of pension funds, insurance companies playing significant role. How do you see the fiscal maneuver to repay the existing domestic debt, be able to continue to deploy fiscal policies that will boost our economic growth?
Before you take the hard part of this, let me take the first part. And the graph I showed you, just to be clear, in the discussion of global imbalances, in which Olivier was very engaged, surpluses of the oil exporters were a key part of that debate for quite a period after 2008. But starting in 2015, those surpluses have basically gone away. Depending on how you group the countries, there's no more surplus of the oil exporters since the sharp fall in energy prices that started in 2014. Now off to you for the hard part.
No, I mean, look, the optimal configuration is not that all imbalances are zero. And we want some countries to have current account surpluses, some countries to have current account deficits. If an oil exporter has very high prices of oil, we want them to have current account surpluses. When the oil price comes down, they have to shift to, at least for some time, to a current account deficit. There is a very tough adjustment to be made. How it is done, it has to be done through fiscal consolidation, in part in those countries, without any question. One of the big questions for the oil exporters is the exchange rate regime, and whether some of them should reconsider the peg or not. It's harder to adjust without the peg, but they are facing, depending on the country, a 10 to 20% decrease in real income. They have to adjust to this, and for a while, they are clearly going to go from current account surpluses to current account deficits.
Okay, I want to try to wrap up. I don't think I can really summarize the panel, but let me just try to put in perspective a bit what we have heard the last couple of days. As his successor, I've tried to imagine what it must have been like for Olivier to arrive here in 2008 and then 2 weeks later to face the Lehman crisis. And, this not only was it a crisis, but I think it's a crisis that sort of challenges all your assumptions your prior assumptions about what the world was like. It's really a paradigm-shifting moment. You go from the Great Moderation to something very different. And the first order of business was to recommend a policy response, and the fund was very aggressive in pushing for global fiscal expansion, coordinated action. Central banks moved very quickly to cut interest rates. Some of them, anyway, did. And but over the succeeding years, and here we are 8 years later, the crisis migrated to Europe in ways that we wouldn't have imagined. As China wound down the stimulus that it had put in place to deal with the crisis, we saw commodity prices begin to fall and adjustment problems moving to emerging markets. Now the U.S. is normalizing, but other advanced economies remain challenged, and many emerging markets remain challenged, even though capital flows have reversed. As we look to the world, just prior to this very important U.S. presidential election, we realize that there are many risks out there. There are political risks, and we all have limited policy space. So in that sort of frame, the topics that were discussed the last couple of days were very appropriate. I think we made progress on the questions. As always, questions remain. But on monetary policy, the papers by Charles looked at the effects of quantitative easing. Jeroman's paper looked at interventions in distressed asset markets and what the effects might be there. And Anil discussed some of the possible collateral effects on financial stability, which figure very, very importantly in the debate. But as Stan just said, monetary policy being the only game in town is something that we are uncomfortable with, even if it is effective in some degree. Structural policy is a big priority in many countries, and Romain's paper, together with Davide, indicated that structural policies can work in generating positive output responses, but their effectiveness depends very much on the state of the business cycle, and one has to be careful about what one does when. Financial stability is a big challenge. There is much work on reform after the crisis. I would say it's a work in progress, and we still struggle with the issue of moral hazard, which was a big theme in Giovanni's paper. So Giovanni has, in his office, he has a quotation from Rudy Dornbusch that every time I walk in there, I realize how wise it is. And what Rudy said is, better moral hazard than the Great Depression. And I think that was the spirit of some of the discussion today. Moral hazard is always going to be there. And, as Trish Mosser said, we need to find ways to manage it. And there may be counterproductive ways to manage it, which tie our hands too tightly. Financial stability is also a big question for emerging markets that might face reversals in capital outflows, and Suman talked about some of those. And I thought John Maria's paper was a very, very cautionary one in terms of showing us the evolution of international investment positions. Kristin just touched on this. And the extent to which, we sort of look at these data, and much of it is driven by tax considerations. And are these stabilizing flows? We also know that regulatory arbitrage has played a very big role. It certainly did before the crisis. So this is still an area where we need to do work. 8 years after the crisis, we still think that aggregate demand is in short supply in many parts of the world. And Larry's lecture was a very triumphal revisitation of the theme he raised 3 years ago, but I think in a justified way. And it raises the question of, do we believe Say's law that supply creates demand, or do we believe that demand creates supply? That seems a very critical question at this point in time. Jan's paper really causes us to rethink the role of investment in aggregate demand. This is a theme that Federico brought up in his talk without having had the benefit of Jan's paper, but you should look at some of her data because she explores the changing nature of investment in the United States. And I think that's something we'll be looking at for many years. Fiscal space. Whenever I hear this, I think of fiscal space, the final frontier. But we're sort of there. And in many countries, fiscal space is up against limits. It may be possible to raise debts in some places, some more, but in some countries, the apparent stability is resting very much on the low interest rate environment, and that may be very fragile. So there is an issue of rebalancing, deleveraging, and what the macro costs of those may be where it is needed. And the Francesco's paper and Tomas' paper both dealt with those issues. Our final session on the labor market, I thought, was incredibly relevant because if we look at the monetary policy challenges or the political challenges, central issues are connected with the growth of wages. Peter Diamond's paper pointed to an issue that's been of concern in the U.S. and other countries about the low churn in labor markets and how that might be related to slow growth in wages. And I found his discussion of employment to employment transitions very illuminating. I agree with Giuseppe Bertola that for understanding labor market dynamics, the global perspective is very interesting, and also for understanding wage dynamics and the effects of international competition. Technology is also key there, and we haven't quite sorted out which is which. But certainly globalization together with technology have certainly increased a sense of insecurity that is very important in the current climate. There's a lot of literature that focuses on the size of government and the relationship between social safety nets and international openness, and the ability of governments to provide the kind of safety nets that might be needed in a world where there's a lot of tax competition. So I think these are also very important issues going forward. And again, we haven't settled all of these in the last 2 days, but I think we've generated some insights that are important, and also a rich set of questions for further research, which as the director of the research department, I'm happy about because it gives us work to do. And it's also work that will be carried out in other departments in the fund as well. I'd like to close by thanking the many people who worked on the logistics and made this conference possible. First of all, as always, Tracy Lucadou, the conference coordinator, and Gustavo Adler was the conference chair. The ARC committee that helped put the program together included Jabin An, Paolo Cavallino, Pierre Olivier, who is the editor-in-chief of the IMF Economic Review and is going to end his term at the end of this year, Grace Bin Lee, Mavash Qureshi, Pao Rabanal, and Damiano Sandri. The conference assistants from throughout the research department contributed. I want to thank them. The communications department has made sure that the discussion here has been disseminated throughout the world. The catering and event management folks were responsible for the good food, the refreshments, and I thank them. I also want to thank security for keeping us all safe, something we don't think about enough, but very important in this world, the audiovisual department. And finally, our intrepid photographer, Steve Jaffe. You've seen him around taking our pictures, and I'm sure some of those will be available. So thank you all. Let's once more thank everyone, thank the panel, and thank Olivier for all of his contributions, not only to the fund, but to our intellectual heritage.